Did you know it's possible to buy an investment property and have it fully paid for by your employer and your tenant? Well, that's essentially what buying an investment property in your self-managed super fund is. Now, does that mean that it's a holy nirvana and there are no negatives? There absolutely are. That's why in today's episode, I'm going to go through how do you buy property in your self-managed super fund? What are the advantages of doing so? And what are some of the disadvantages of doing so that you can make an informed decision? If that's what you're interested in, stay tuned. Hello, it's Nero here, founder of the Investment Rise Buyers Agency. And if you're new to my channel, hit that subscribe button because I talk about all things related to the property market and the economy. Now, before we even start looking at buying a property in your super funds, the first question is, well, do you even need to bother? Is it worth doing? Well, when we look at this data from AMP, what we can see is that when we look at people who are in their ages of 60 to 64, men on average have a super balance of $402,838, women $318,203. Now, why do women in general have a lower superannuation balance? Purely because there are times when many women during their working career take a career break, either to have kids or to look after their kids. So the number of years that they're in the workforce is actually lower, hence they have a lower super balance. Now, do I agree with that? No, but my thoughts on that matter are out of scope for this episode. Well, let's take a couple who are approaching the age of 65. So if we take the man's average balance and the woman's average balance, we get a total of about $720,000 in their super. That's just average leading into retirement. Well, now, is that enough? Well, I was speaking to a financial planner recently to work out how she does her financial plans for her clients. And she said that she works out that based on the sum of money someone has at retirement, they will then get a return on that of 4%. Now, 4% of $720,000 for this average couple that we're looking at works out to be $28,800. That's the income they would derive from their superannuation balance. Now, of course, you might be wondering, but then Nero, what do you do with the other $720,000? You don't touch that, because if you start drawing on that, what we call drawing down on the principal, then that means that your returns in the future will be less because you have less principal, right? So if you have $700,000, 4% of that is going to be much higher than if you only have $600,000 left and you're getting 4% on that. So in this scenario, we're not touching the principal. This couple is getting $28,800 per year. Now, is that enough? Well, the first thing is, has a couple paid off their own home? If they have, of course, this will be a much better scenario for them. The problem though is that according to research released by the Super Members Council of Australia, up to 40% of people who retire now are retiring with a mortgage. And in that scenario, getting an income of $28,800 is certainly not going to be sufficient. But even if you have paid off your home, is it enough? Well, again, looking at AMP's data, what they say is that for a comfortable lifestyle, a couple would need to be able to have an income of $72,663. That's nearly 3 times the average. And for a modest lifestyle, $47,387 a year, still well above the average income of $28,800. So clearly this shows that the current superannuation system is broken. If you rely on it, the odds are you're not going to have enough in your retirement. You're going to be working for 40 years and get to that age 65 or whenever it is that you retire and realize you don't have enough. That would be a very, very scary position to be in. So then what are your options? Well, one of them is that you can take control of your superannuation by creating a self-managed super fund. Now, I am not a financial planner. This is not financial advice. So you'll need to do your own due diligence, but you can certainly choose to set up a self-managed superannuation fund, and then you can choose to invest it how you see fit. Today, I'm going to talk about how you invest in property. So the first question is, how much do you need to invest in property in your self-managed super? Well, buying property in your super fund is different to buying property in your personal name. And I'll go through some of the differences here today, but one of the first differences is that you need a minimum of 20%. So let's say, for example, that you want to buy a property for, say, $600,000. Now, I know that you can buy property at $500,000 in smaller regional markets. My perspective here on buying property in your super is that this is for your retirement. So you want to minimize risk. And so if you're going to buy property that's really cheap, maybe in a small country town or a small regional market in Australia, you need to consider the risk profile. Does it have the economic diversity? Does it have the economic strength and the ongoing demand to keep property prices rising? My assessment is that most of these markets in 2024 and going forwards that are quite cheap right now have greater risks associated with them, maybe not in the short term, but certainly in the medium to long term. And remember, buying property in your self-managed super fund is a long-term investment, because the other thing that you cannot do in your super is you can't do what many people do in their personal names, which is they buy a property, it rises in value, they take the equity out of that property, and then they go and buy another property. That's not something you can do in your self-managed super fund. You can't take equity out of a property. Now, there is a particular workaround that you can apply, which I will address towards the end of this episode, but in principle, it's not something you can do. The next thing people often ask me is, well, can you buy property in your superannuation and then have the property rise in value and then sell it and then take the funds to pay off your mortgage? Well, the answer is, especially in the short to medium term, the answer is no. Here's why. You see, the way I explain it to many of our clients who ask about whether we can help them buy property in their super fund is, just imagine that you have yourself on one side of this line, and then you have your twin on the other side of this line. Okay, now when you're buying property in your self-managed super fund, imagine it's your twin that's buying the property. So they could buy a property for, say, $600,000. It could rise in value, yes, and then they could sell that property, realize the gains, but then the cash has to stay in your super fund. You can't take it out, at least not while you're working. Take that money out of your super and then in your personal name, and then do whatever you want with it, which is to pay off your mortgage or whatever it is that you want to do. This is why when I'm asked, should I buy property in my personal name or should I buy property in my self-managed super fund? My answer is it depends on your goals. If, for example, one of your goals is to buy investment property that rises in value so then you can sell to pay off your mortgage, you would do that by buying property in your personal name, okay? Because then you're in control of the funds. If, for example, you're looking to buy property that rises in value, and then you can use those properties and the profits you gain from those properties to then go and buy your own home, so maybe you adopt a rent vesting strategy, again, you would buy property in your personal name. So the only time you're going to be buying property in your self-managed super fund is that maybe you can't buy property in your personal name, maybe you already have some properties and you run out of borrowing capacity, or you don't have the equity, whatever the case is, and you want to keep buying properties. Maybe you're not happy with the returns that you're getting in your super right now, especially over recent times with the massive volatility we've seen in the share market. Maybe you're not happy with that. And if you then decide that you would like to choose a different retirement vehicle in terms of your super, you could then buy property in your superannuation. But essentially what you're doing here is you're buying property in your self-managed super fund. It's like your twin buying it. The profits all stay in the super fund, and you can only then access any profits from that once you turn 60, 65, 67, whatever the laws happen to be at the point in time when you're looking to take out the money. So that's a big thing to be aware of, is that you're investing in your super, yes, but it is a long-term vehicle. You're not trying to buy property in your super fund to realize the money in 5 years, especially if you're, say, 45 or 50 right now. That's why when you understand that key difference, I advocate buying property in your self-managed super fund in low-risk areas. Areas that are less susceptible to volatility, areas that have multiple industries feeding them, stronger owner occupancy demand, people moving into the area, buying properties, because in those circumstances, those areas are likely to keep growing year on year. They may not necessarily experience explosive growth like some of the more volatile areas will. However, compounded year on year, you are likely to get much better and much safer returns by buying properties of a good quality in good quality areas. And that's why I don't advocate buying cheaper properties in small country towns in your super. So coming back to the question of, well, how much do you need to buy property in your super? You need to come up with a minimum 20% deposit. So say we look at a purchase price here of $600,000. Okay, your deposit 20% is going to be $120,000. And then you're going to have your fees, so your buyer's agency fees, if you decide to use a buyer's agent, stamp duty, everything else, okay? So in this scenario, I'm going to estimate that your fees might be, say, $40,000, okay? So that means in total, you need $160,000 in cash to buy this property. Now, there is something called a liquidity requirement with your super fund, and you need to get the right advice on this. But essentially what it means is that you can't use all your cash in your super to buy a property. So if you only had $160,000 in your superannuation in this scenario, you probably would not be able to go and get that particular property, okay? You need some extra cash. So I would say you're probably going to need somewhere around $200,000 in cash in your self-managed super fund to allow you to go and then buy an investment property and still keep some cash left over. Now let's imagine you have this property, you bought it for $600,000 in your superannuation, and you have a debt of $480,000 against the property, which is 80% of the purchase price. The question is then, what is this property going to be worth? Now let's imagine an average growth rate of 6% per annum. That's a very conservative growth rate. So at a 6% growth rate, compounded yearly after 10 years, your $600,000 property will be worth over $1 million, $1.074 million. And after 20 years, the property would be worth $1.9 million. By that time as well, you would have more than likely fully paid off the loan on that property, because remember, you have the rents coming in, rents are rising over time, then you have your employer super contributions coming in as well, which are more than likely increasing based on your salary increasing. So expecting a property in your self-managed super fund to be paid off over 20 years is very conservative. On average, I see most people pay them off in 15 years. So now you have an asset worth $1.9 million sitting in your super, fully paid off. You probably also have some surplus cash as well, but let's ignore that for the moment. The question then is, what do you do with this asset? Well, again, if we just look at 4% returns, a 4% rental income on this particular property, that means that this $1.9 million property, which you bought for $600,000, will now be giving you $76,971 in income. Now that's gross income. Of course, you're going to have some expenses. You'll have to pay some council rates. You'll have to pay some insurance. You'll have some property management fees. Let's take $6,000 off. So you're at $70,000 income versus $29,000 previous to this in the example we looked at. If you had not invested in property, we've increased your income by 2.5 times. And based on what we saw from AMP earlier on, that essentially allows you to have a comfortable lifestyle. Now, of course, in 20 years' time, prices will be higher, so you will need more than $70,000. But this is just with one property. What happens if you could do 2 properties? You would then double this and you'd be getting an income of potentially $140,000, which will be more than enough based off these calculations that we're looking at. Or secondly, you may decide, okay, I'm going to sell my property, say after 7 or 8 years, it's made a substantial gain. I'm going to pay some capital gains tax on that, but now you're going to end up with a lot more cash. And then you might use that cash to go and buy 2 other properties. So instead of just having 1, you now have 2 properties, and then that's going to compound over time. The key thing here to understand is that buying property in your self-managed super fund is quite straightforward from a conceptual perspective, but there are a lot of moving parts. That's why you need to get the right help. We've been helping our clients buy property in their self-managed super fund for years. We've got multiple clients who've done this, so we can definitely assist you with this. So if you'd like some help in terms of how do you buy property in your super, check out the link in the description below and book a free consult with a member of my team. But even if you don't, the key takeaway message here is that you can buy property in your super. There are some things to consider, but it's very, very doable, and make sure you're getting the right advice and the right help to make this happen for you. If you feel this episode helped, please share it with someone else, because I think that based on the data right now, too many Australians are going to struggle in retirement because they're just not going to have enough in superannuation. They're going to need to take control of their super. And if property is the low risk investment vehicle they choose, then I'd love for them to be looking at this information to make an informed decision.